So when we arrived here on Wednesday about 2 o'clock, we were greeted by Graham with the surprising news that there was a riot and that something needed to happen because this riot was totally unbounded in its consequences, in how it would affect us, in the very idea we had in our mind about what we were doing in being here. And it was a real shock that suddenly our whole sort of comfortable view of what we were going to be doing the next few days was suddenly totally overturned. And we were left in this total void of not knowing at all, you know, how long these riots would last, what would be the consequence. And it was quite a shock. And it was not, however, the fact that we were no longer in the nice PDF program of what was said was going to happen in the form of the laws of form did not mean that the laws of form thereby stopped functioning. Because once we put our emphasis on being in the unknown, then we found there was some kind of fluidity, there was some kind of process we could go through in order to reconstitute the laws of form and our program together. And so once we inhabited the unknown and put attention to it instead of the form we were expecting to meet, we had the same kind of fluidity that Spence Brown attributes to the forms, because we could make space for other people's attempt to deal with this shock. And we could try to work together about what were the possible pathways which could lead to something sustainable and coherent happening. And this has long kind of concerned me, that if the form in laws of form is something that's fluid, where it's both a movement and a content, and thereby it gives this extra dimensionality to logic, then the same must be true for the empty space. Because if the form is dynamic in how it appears and disappears, then the space it fills must also be dynamic in how it vanishes when the form appears, or appears when the form disappears. So it was a huge opportunity that we were in this state of being in laws of form from this perspective of the unknown. And it was clear that what we had to do was arrive at a new form, not the form that was in the PDF program. And this form had to be responsive to context. I mean, the context, and I mean, most immediately, of the riot happening down the road. So this is the kind of basis of the laws of context that I want to discuss. That it does not simply exist in the form. It exists both in the space and the form. The fluidity of the algebra of laws of form, and that it's in the meeting of the two that you get this contextual response by which you arrive at form together. So that's where I'm hoping to take us in this short talk, to ask, what are the laws of context? Under what conditions do they arise? What might be the characteristics of the laws of context that would make this movement from the laws of form as something that's kind of constructs itself from inside, like the initial program was a kind of totality of all the different talks that were going to happen, and change that to a law of context, which is this sort of bigger question: how does emptiness give birth to form in an unchangeable context where we no longer know, we are no longer referenced by fixed anchor points about how we should move and behave? And of course, the riot was a precursor, one felt, to many more disturbances, to what we expect to be the obvious course of things and how they happen. So the laws of context is very relevant, not just to the riot, but to our whole need to have a logic that can adequately adapt to changing circumstances. So I was a computer programmer for a long time, and recently I heard from a colleague about, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this, I think it was his imagination that came up with it. But he was taught computer logic through this thing of test, operate, test, exit. So the basis of computer logic is you test something, that leads to an operation, then you test it again, and at some point you exit. So I just want to focus on these tests again. So here's an example of code where you've got these tests, and I want to ask, what are these tests? Because these tests are not something fixed in the logic as a hard kind of pathway. They're something open to context, because the tests might have many different values, and according to these values and the test you perform will decide where the course of the logic goes. But these tests are like the empty space. They're spaces of possibility through which the logic operates. And when you're programming, finding these tests is absolutely critical, that each organization suggests its own particular test of what it is particular to that system that that one needs to represent in order to best capture the behavior of the system. So this was an example. This was planning software, which I made to help planning. And before this organization planned things, there was this sort of pre-stage where you decided what skills you need for a particular task and what was demanded of the location. And that the software would then check who was available to fill these different positions and where you could actually run this task in order to translate it from something possible and potential into something actual, which people could go to and which was planned and then had a status of something operational and actual. And so finding this kind of form, this task block of how this planning system worked was crucial in understanding how the organization could operate. And the advantage of this pre-stage was that it could both, if there weren't the right people to run it, this task would just drop off because it could not run in the context in which it was being required, but it would only come into existence within an overall plan that would apply the people to the positions, not just for this task block, but for everybody, so that maximally the work and the people would match. And this was quite apposite for the situation we were in on that Wednesday morning, because the discussions that were happening were, should we move Lou's presentation to another day? What would that mean for everybody else's presentation? Maybe we should move the location to a place that wasn't near a refugee center and demand from the university they give us a room that was usable. So this way of being able to meet an unknown situation by being able to change the fixity of what one has put in place, you could see it in action on Wednesday, how we navigated that space and asked questions about what needed to change to allow optimally the whole program to work, and obviously to meet the fact that many people had spent a lot of time and money coming here. So this just describes what I've just said. Another example is in genes, where you have these cascades of genes that turn on and off other genes. And some of these pathways can be tens or hundreds of genes deep. And according to the context, according to various stimuli, will decide what course of action that plant or organism undertakes. And I also did this work with Bristol University on the genes that were to do with dehydration and the animal's response to dehydration. And when I came, the professor was trying to look for specific genes that were switched on to affect dehydration. But actually, when one looked at it, it was much more that there was a whole landscape of possibility that changed completely when the context was different. So it was not that one or two genes changed. It was like it re-articulated its whole response of itself with completely different genes acting in order to cope with the fact that there was a lack of water in the context, and it had to survive in a different situation than if there was ample water. So once again, we see that the plant is navigating this space between emptiness or not existing and existence. And it's not simply acting in existence as a kind of pre-programmed ordering of life. So, so the plant gives us another understanding about why we need the laws of context. Because the plant, this isn't just a collection of cells as forms that act independently and have some kind of mysterious relating in all these funny symbols that creates life. It's much more that the plant is navigating this space between emptiness and existence. And it's this navigation that creates this, what we recognize as life, as something coherent and yet multiply adaptive and multiply responsive. So this is just saying that all the different factors that might go into, say, when a leaf flowers, where it actually counts the number of cold days and the length of days. So now I want to get to logic itself. So I want to say, why do we need this jump, and how does it fit in different schools of logic? So, of course, the first system of logic that Spencer Brown responded to was laws of thought by Ball in 1854, which kind of tried to situate logic within a generality of what could be thought and seen as true and false. And this was superseded by Spencer Brown's laws of form in 1969. And laws of form, it was not a stillness of instructions about how things came to existence in the theorem. It was the laws of form is much more a movement of form, where the movement and the content are simultaneous. And the achievement of laws of form is that the thought appears in the form and the form appears in the thought. There's some kind of enfolding of the idea of form into the previous laws of thought of Ball, in which one understands form by way of exercising it. And similarly, in laws of context, the idea that we're trying to do is to extend laws of form. So the form appears in the context and the context appears in the form. So we're trying to, at the very basis of what we call logic, to try to establish that there's some kind of natural pathway between the logic of space, of emptiness, of things that aren't expressed, with the logic of form, where things are expressed and are giving rise to a form that's responsive to the context as a whole. So we're saying that this law of context is not just particular, it's not just individual forms and how they locally appear. There's something universal about it. And that this universality is kind of selecting various particular events that have the possibility of realizing this movement at a local level, from the emptiness to the fullness. And and it has a lot to do, like a story, where the story developed the characters, as Leon would say, and the characters develop the plot. But a good plot, at the end, surprises one, because the context transforms in which the story is unfolding. So the local divulges itself at the moment that the universal expresses itself through the context. So here I've just put, so here we have stillness of ideas as foundation to a landscape of logic, movement of distinction as reference to its own interpretation of form. And here in laws of context, we find the equilibrium point of stillness and movement as illumination to the process. So we're trying to, in a way, translate the movement of logic into the natural world, into logic itself. That's what logic is trying to do, is tell its own story. And to do that, it has to test itself in new ways in order to develop the characters so that they come together and tell this story in a way that's interpretable and accessible to everybody. So the laws of form, the outside moves to the inside, and so it's both the crossing and the content. And so what we've got here is that what we understand is something that's, I'm grateful to the people from Anywhere Out of the World Bookshop for suggesting this, because I wrote about laws of form very quickly, the inside and the outside. And they said, oh, it's like an open kind of boundary where what you're looking at the beginning is neither movement nor form, outside nor inside. It's open as to how it's like a character in a book. It's open as to how it will develop through the story. And the purpose of the story is also open, but the purpose of the story is to bring this openness through different stages of transformation inwardly until you come to a kind of deciding focus or point of determination at which this whole space becomes judged for itself. And it's at this point that the universal and the particular meet, because you can say that, like when you're reading a book, you're not sure exactly what the context is of the story you're reading. And the way you associate all the characters, all the events, all the elements only becomes clear at the end, where suddenly, just on the edge of the whole thing dissipating, you suddenly fall into this meaning. Yeah, 5 minutes, that's great. So this is the kind of logical enfolding of the laws of form into a larger context in which instead of the form simply being at the threshold of emptiness, it's also at the threshold of coherence and fullness, as something that can tell its own story through its own openness at the beginning. And one way I've tried to talk about this in the proceedings from the first conference was that the stages are like colors, because the colors naturally mediate between darkness and light. And so you've got these intermediary stages that kind of fold together into light as an illumination of where you've been going, but it also has the capacity to undo its process and dissipate into the darkness. So, so the idea is that all of this is not something imposed on logic; it's something innate to logic that can kind of test any context for its possibility to renew itself through its elemental characters and possibilities. So this was also from the conversation I had at the bookshop about, so they were talking about music and painting, how you try to make symmetrical in resolution what is asymmetrical in the elements you begin with. The elements you start with are disturbing. They're characters that don't naturally fit together. And that this creative process is something they totally understood, and they totally resonated with the laws of form as I described it. And I also think it has relevance to our physical understanding, because normally in physics, we talk about how do the elements, the local elements arise, but we don't include in that this act of coherence. How do these local elements transform the whole context of something renewing itself out of death and destruction? And so that's pretty, don't have to go there. And so, yeah, the universe must relate to context newly to interpret the tension of stillness and movement. The universe cannot be understood as stillness or movement only. And so I even mentioned quaternions there, which I was talking to Lou about, but so the basic movement of science isn't simply to fragment existence into its parts. It's rather to find this movement of nothing to something that is able to tell the story of the universe anew, both rationally and mythically. So that's a funny slide. Anyway, that's it for the moment. So any questions? Yeah, Lou.
It's just a comment that I think, to the extent that you look at laws of form as going well beyond a discussion of logic to a discussion of distinction as interactions of contexts, one has a big open channel between thinking in terms of laws of form and thinking the way you're thinking.
Yeah. Well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that navigable, that channel, do you think?
Well, certainly. I mean, I don't think that laws of form is actually about logic per se. Laws of form has an application to logic, or it has something to say about what logic might be it is not a book of logic, but a book of mathematics or a book of philosophy or a book of context, indeed.
Yeah. So, yeah, implicit in it is this idea of context. Anyway, any ideas how to make that go through that channel would be highly appreciated.
Well, what happens then is many people work with laws of form in different ways, right? It's quite fascinating to see how that happens, because some people work with it without using logic, without using mathematics, but just thinking about interactions of context. For example, sociologists who are working with laws of form are looking at interactions of context and using then some of the symbolism that happens in laws of form as a way of depicting the indicational forms that are useful for their way of thinking about context.
Yeah.
But we also need not be restricted to any particular indicational forms.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really true. Because
I think the modulator function is probably one of the places to start, because that, in fact, is a construct that responds to its environment. You send signals into the modulator function, and it changes its states and produces an output that's, in the case of the example that Spencer Brown gave, is half the frequency of the input. So that's the pretty much the simplest organism that you can think of in laws of form.
Yeah.
And it gets pretty complicated. Well, we know how complicated we are. So you have to deal with that complication by picking your contractions of reference carefully, so that you do not, remember, reference can be contracted as long as you can follow the step. So if you contract your references as you're going along analyzing this, and you contract it beyond the point where you can actually follow the step, then you're going to get into trouble, and the trickster will come and whisper in your ear, has God not truly said this? We can do it differently. And that's the main problem with all of science and philosophy and everything, is making sure that you stay on the path by steps, and that you understand the meaning of the step that you took.
Indeed, coming to the modulator is like coming to some wonderful working organism, but we can also take the stance of designers and think about how you might make one. And then you start with something simpler, like simple self-reference and memory, and coming up through to how you might build one. But how might nature build one? How might it happen in an evolutionary way?
Yeah.
Which you ask about organisms.
Yeah, I'm thinking of I was playing this game where you had to do lateral thinking. And I suggested that somebody fell off their chair as my lateral thinking exercise. And we went round and round for a half, but I didn't really know why I'd set this example. So I'd wasted everybody's time. And then one of the participants said, "Are you pulling our leg?" And I said, "Yes, that's why he fell off the chair." And it's this thing that form can happen completely surprisingly. And even though you're not sure of the steps you've taken, you know when you arrive, because that arrival somehow illuminates everybody. Everybody burst into laughter, because suddenly the game had a meaning you didn't know. The context had kind of transformed itself. And you realized any context can transform itself. That's part of its innate nature. Leon.
Thank you. In response to your talk, I was wowed. I've too much to say, too many questions to ask, but thank you. I will ask one though, which is from my own application of the COI to stories. What I've found is that the end is already contained within the beginning.
Yeah.
Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so part of, I can say this in terms of color because it's got a really neat exposition that Newton had his theory of optics in which he said that the color is in the light. And he basically dismissed the darkness and said color was an explanation of light, which is like existence in our example. And then Goethe came along and said, no, color is a movement that's responding to the boundary of darkness and light. And he did an experiment where he showed that shades have color. If you have a red light, then a shadow will appear blue with that red light. And this couldn't be explained in Goethe's Newton's terms. But it actually is a very nice symmetry that Newton says the colors are in the light, and Goethe says the colors are in the dark. And actually, what you must come to is that and this is same with Spencer Brown. The color is actually there, both in the darkness and the light. The darkness isn't completely empty. The color is already there. And same with the emptiness and the fullness and the form. Spencer Brown's logic, algebra or fluid logic is already there. So what we're doing, so as an example at the Big Bang, it was not that nothing has to immediately go to something by some weird explosion that's supposed to have happened. The color was already in the dark, and so the colors could transform into the light. Same with Spencer Brown's logic. It was already in the emptiness, and so could transform into existence. And when that first moment had happened and existence came into being, it was not an end state of existence. That darkness was, the colors were in the light too. And so the light could itself fragment, the devil could be a fallen angel, existence could happen in terms of separation. So this is a completely different idea that the impulse of existence is already there in the dark and the light, waiting to be told, and through that telling to transform itself from the dark into the light in a way that brings its own order. It's not a sudden explosion of the Big Bang, and it's something that's continuing. So this is a real shift for what we mean by science. We're not imposing an order from outside. We're finding that natural order by which things unfold themselves.
There is time. I know this is an enthusiastic topic, continuous creation, cosmogony, and light. So I'm up next, so I'm happy to take another question for Philip. Yeah,
Andrew.
You gave a potted history which went from George Boole to Spencer Brown, but I know how interested you are in Goethe. Can you relate Goethe to George Boole? Is there any link there?
Well, Goethe was before Boole.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, he died in 1749 to 1832. And so Goethe was at a time in which logic was still open. The empty space was still existing, and scientists understood that you had to engage the empty space to understand existence. And so that was Goethe's point. But around 1850, there was a cosmic shift. So there was Darwin's theory of evolution, there was Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism, and there was the idea was that there was just existence. All we had to do was, straighten the canals, go into the mathematics, intellectualize the world, and we would get to this ultimate order that could overwrite the natural order. And so Boole was a way of facilitating this. How can we make logic the most the most functional and quick to use as possible, so we can create all these technologies? So Boole was a kind of overriding of that romantic idea of nature and science. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Mm.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.